When the judge left town, his wife looked at me with a half-smile and said, "You should come by, keep me company." I told myself it was innocent. But nothing about that week felt innocent. I never thought much about the judge's wife. She was always there, of course, graceful, well-dressed, carrying herself with the kind of quiet confidence that made you notice her even if she wasn't trying. Everyone in town knew her as his wife. The judge's wife. Polite, elegant, untouchable. But that afternoon was different. I had just finished a delivery of some case files, small-town errands that somehow always fell into my lap, and when I stepped onto their porch, the sun was sinking low behind me. Warm light spilled across her doorway, and for a moment she looked like she belonged to another world entirely. She opened the door, holding it with one hand, and gave me a smile I didn't expect, soft, almost playful. "Thank you," she said, taking the envelope from my hands. Then, almost as if she were thinking out loud, she added, "He's out of town all week. You should stop by sometime, keep me company." The words were simple. Casual. She probably didn't even realize the weight they carried. But the way she said them, just lightly enough, just warmly enough, made something stir inside me that I couldn't quite name. I hesitated. I wasn't blind. I knew the stories people whispered about age, propriety, appearances. She was in her early 40s, stunning in a way that didn't need to announce itself. I was 25, old enough to know better, young enough to feel the gravity of an invitation like that. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "Well, I wouldn't want to intrude." Her eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary, a kind of pause that seemed to stretch the air between us. Then she tilted her head, her earrings catching the last of the sunlight. "It wouldn't be an intrusion," she said. "This house gets quiet when he's gone." And that was it. No hidden meaning, no suggestion beyond the obvious. At least, that's what I told myself. But when I walked back down her front steps, I found myself replaying her voice in my head. The way she leaned against the doorframe, one hand resting casually on the wood, as if she wasn't inviting me into her home, but into something far more dangerous, her solitude. The whole walk home, I couldn't shake the picture, the judge's wife, standing there in the doorway with golden light pooling around her, her words hanging between us like an open door I wasn't sure I should step through. By the time I reached my apartment, I already knew. No matter how much I told myself it was innocent, no matter how much I tried to downplay it, I'd stop by. Because some invitations aren't about what's said. They're about what's left unspoken. I told myself I wasn't going. I told myself it was better to leave her words hanging in the air like they were never spoken. But by the time the week had worn on, I found myself walking toward her house anyway, convincing myself it was nothing. Just neighborly. Just company. When she opened the door, she didn't look surprised. Almost like she'd been expecting me. "Come in," she said, her tone light but warm. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair tied loosely, not at all like the carefully put-together version of her I'd seen at church or social gatherings. It made her look real. Human. The house smelled of garlic and rosemary, something simmering on the stove. She waved me toward the kitchen as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I made too much. Sit, you'll help me finish it." I hesitated only a second before sliding into a chair at the small kitchen table. She moved with practiced ease, stirring a pot, then setting plates down in front of me. The clinking of dishes, the soft hum of the oven, and the faint ticking of the wall clock filled the room. Somehow, it felt warmer than any fancy restaurant could have been. We talked. At first about nothing, books stacked on her counter, her garden, my job. But little by little, the words settled into a rhythm, like water finding its course. She laughed at something I said, the sound richer than I remembered. When she reached across to hand me a basket of bread, her fingers brushed against mine. It was quick, accidental maybe, but the heat of it stayed long after. I tried to focus on my food, on anything else, but my mind wouldn't let go of that flicker of contact. "You don't have to feel awkward," she said suddenly, catching my silence. Her eyes lingered on me, steady, unreadable. It's nice, having someone here. He doesn't like small talk, you know. This? She gestured vaguely to the table, the food to me. It feels easy. I nodded, though my chest tightened at her honesty. She didn't say she was lonely. She didn't have to. It was there in the way her shoulders softened, in the way her voice lowered on that last word. Easy. The evening slipped by without either of us noticing. The food disappeared, the plates sat forgotten, and the conversation turned into something quieter. Not confessions, not secrets, just two people filling the silence that life had left them with. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. The house was dim now, only a small lamp glowing in the hallway. I turned to thank her, but she reached out first, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Come again tomorrow, if you like, she said softly. Her touch was barely there, but I felt it all the way through me. I nodded, my throat too tight for words. And as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something had shifted. What began as politeness was becoming something else. Something fragile. Something I wasn't sure I had the strength to resist. The next evening, she suggested we take a walk through her garden. I think she could sense I wasn't used to sitting still in someone else's home, and out there among the winding paths and rows of flowers, it was easier to breathe. The sun had already dipped, leaving behind only a faint ribbon of gold on the horizon. Small solar lights lined the path, glowing softly, guiding us through the beds of roses and lavender. The air was cool, carrying the faintest scent of earth and blooming petals. She walked slowly, her hand brushing against the tops of flowers as though she were listening to them. I followed beside her, hands in my pockets, unsure of what to say. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to fill silence. It seemed to bend toward her, to soften in her presence. Finally she spoke. It's funny, isn't it? Everyone looks at me and sees the judge's wife. That's the whole of me, at least in their eyes. They see his shadow before they see me. Her voice wasn't bitter, just tired. I glanced at her, trying to read the expression she kept turned toward the roses. And what do you wish they saw? I asked. She smiled faintly, almost as if the question was both kind and impossible. Me, she whispered. Whoever that is anymore. The words landed heavier than I expected. I thought about how often people reduced her to a title, an accessory to her husband's reputation. It struck me then how rarely anyone must have stopped to ask her who she was beneath all that. We paused near a patch of lilies. She bent down to bring one closer, inhaling its faint sweetness. As she straightened, she reached lightly for my arm, steadying herself. It should have been nothing, an instinctive touch, no more than a moment, but her hand lingered. The warmth of it spread through me before she let go. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My chest tightened with the weight of what Hung said between us. We walked on, slower now, the night wrapping itself around us. The stars had begun to prick through the dark, and a thin sliver of moon rose over the rooftops. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her face caught for an instant in the glow of the garden light. You remind me of something I used to be, she said quietly. Before life became courtrooms and dinners and being someone's polished half. I didn't know how to answer. Part of me wanted to tell her I saw her, saw the softness, the loneliness, the strength she didn't speak of. But I stayed silent, afraid that saying it aloud might shatter the fragile truth hanging in the air. So instead, I just walked beside her, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The quiet between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of things she couldn't say, and things I didn't dare. And as we turned back toward the house, I realized that somewhere in the stillness of her garden, a boundary had shifted. Not crossed, not broken, but shifted, like soil loosened after the first rain. The fourth evening, the air outside turned cool and restless, so we stayed indoors. She suggested a film, something light she said she hadn't watched in years. I don't even remember the title, only the way the glow of the screen painted her face in soft colors. We sat side by side on her couch, a blanket folded neatly between us that neither of us touched. The film played, voices drifting in and out, but it was the quiet in the room that seemed to take over. The kind of silence that isn't empty but filled with questions either of you dares to ask. I became painfully aware of how close she was. Not touching, not quite, just near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. Every small movement, her shifting slightly in her seat, the way her hand rested on the cushion near mine, pulled at the edges of my focus. Her perfume was faint but constant, a soft floral note that made me dizzy in the stillness. And when she leaned back, sighing quietly at something on the screen, her shoulder brushed mine. Just barely. But it was enough to set my pulse racing. I stared at the television, pretending to watch, while inside me there was a storm I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to close the space between us, to let my hand cover hers, to let her know what I couldn't say. But another part knew the line was too thin, too dangerous to cross. She must have sensed my restlessness, because after a while she spoke, low, almost to herself. "You make the house feel less empty." The words hung there, quiet but heavy. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes stayed on the flickering light of the film. But I felt the truth of it anyway, in the way her voice softened, in the way her hand shifted just a fraction closer to mine. I swallowed hard, not trusting my own voice. I wanted to answer, to tell her she made my days feel less ordinary, that she was the most vivid part of my week. But all I managed was a nod, a small sound of agreement that probably sounded nothing like what I meant. The film ended eventually, though I couldn't have told you how. She reached for the remote, switched off the television, and the room fell into a softer, deeper silence. The kind that made you notice your own breathing. She turned to me then, her face only a few inches away, her eyes searching mine as if she were weighing something invisible between us. My chest tightened. For one impossible second, I thought she might close the distance. But instead, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held more sadness than joy, and whispered, "Thank you for being here." And that was all. We sat there, side by side, in the quiet of her living room, surrounded by the weight of everything we didn't say. The weather turned on the fifth night. By the time I reached her porch, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the roof and spilling in streaks down the windows. She met me at the door with a smile, as though the storm outside made my arrival more expected, more natural. "Come in," she said, tugging me quickly inside before the wind could follow. The house felt warmer than usual, the kind of warmth you notice only when you've left the cold behind. She moved toward the kitchen, her footsteps quiet against the wooden floor. "Tea?" she asked over her shoulder. I nodded, settling at the table while she filled the kettle. Her hands moved gracefully, but I noticed something I hadn't before, the faint tremor when she set the cups down, the way she steadied herself with a small breath. She poured, slid a cup toward me, and for a moment, her fingers brushed mine. Longer this time. Deliberate, maybe? The storm deepened outside. Thunder rolled somewhere far off, the lights flickered, and then, without warning, the power cut. Darkness fell, sudden and heavy, broken only by the sound of rain hammering the roof. I froze. She gave a small laugh, low and a little nervous, before striking a match. One candle, then another, their flames softening the edges of the room, throwing golden shadows across her face. She sat across from me, the candlelight catching the glint of her eyes. The silence between us grew dense, thicker than the storm outside. And in that silence, our gazes found each other, and didn't let go. Her hand rested on the table, close enough that if I moved mine just an inch, we'd be touching. I thought about it, my chest rising and falling too quickly, my pulse loud in my ears. Her lips parted, as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Instead, the world seemed to narrow until it was only her, the candlelight, and the pull between us. I leaned forward slightly, unable to stop myself. Just enough that I felt the heat of her breath. She didn't move away. Her eyes searched mine, and for one suspended moment, everything else fell away. Then she reached out, not to close the space, but to steady me. Her hand covered mine, warm and trembling, and she gave it a firm, deliberate squeeze. The kind of touch that said both "I feel this too and we can't." I swallowed, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. My heart ached with the nearness of what almost was. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was low, threaded with something fragile. "For being here." I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. Her hand stayed on mine a second longer before she pulled away, the space between us restored, though never quite the same. The storm raged on outside, but inside it was quieter than ever. Quieter and heavier, with the echo of a kiss that never happened, but lived between us all the same. By the 6th evening, I could feel the end drawing close. The week had passed more quickly than I imagined, each night with her slipping through my fingers like something borrowed, something that was never really mine to hold. When she opened the door that night, her smile was softer, more subdued. There was no playful lightness, no casual invitation. Only a quiet knowing, as if both of us understood this was the last time. We sat in the living room, no film playing, no distraction this time. Just the glow of a single lamp, the faint hum of rain still lingering from earlier in the day. She held a glass of wine loosely in her hand, swirling it once before setting it aside untouched. "He'll be back tomorrow," she said gently, as if easing me into something I already knew. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She studied me for a moment, her eyes searching, maybe memorizing. "This week, it meant more to me than I can explain. You reminded me of who I am, outside of all this." She gestured vaguely, as if pointing to the house, the walls, the invisible expectations that lived inside them. I swallowed hard, trying to find words that wouldn't sound clumsy or selfish. "I should be thanking you," I managed. "You let me see a part of you no one else gets to. It matters." Her lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes glistened, catching the light. She leaned forward then, closing the space between us in the gentlest way possible. Her hand reached up, brushing lightly against my hair, smoothing it back as if she'd been doing it her whole life. The touch was tender, unhurried, carrying more affection than any words could. And then she pressed her lips softly against my cheek. It wasn't rushed, wasn't careless. It lingered, long enough for me to feel the warmth of her mouth, the steadiness of her breath, long enough for me to understand it wasn't just gratitude. It was everything she couldn't say, everything she wouldn't allow herself to give. When she drew back, her eyes stayed on mine, full of a sorrow that was also strangely peaceful. "Some things can't be," she whispered. "But that doesn't make them less real." I wanted to argue, to tell her we could make it real if we wanted. But I didn't. Because deep down, I knew she was right. This week had been a borrowed world, fragile and fleeting, never meant to stretch into forever. So I only nodded, letting the aches sit heavy in my chest. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Her hand slipped into mine for a moment, her fingers squeezing with a quiet finality, before she let go. And then I stepped out into the cool night, the sound of the door closing behind me soft but sharp, like the end of a song I wasn't ready to stop listening to. Time has a way of dulling things, softening memories until they feel more like dreams than days you actually lived. But that week never dulled. It stayed sharp in my mind, carved into me in ways I couldn't explain. I still see her sometimes. At community gatherings, or walking through the market with her husband beside her. Always poised, always immaculate, as though nothing in her life ever slipped out of place. People still greet her as the judge's wife, and she smiles the same careful smile, giving them exactly what they expect. But every so often, her eyes find mine across the room. Just for a second. Not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to feel the quiet echo of what we shared. A private acknowledgement, unspoken, unseen, but unmistakably there. When I pass her in those moments, I don't speak. She doesn't either. And yet, in the space of that silence, everything returns, the golden glow of her doorway, the warmth of her kitchen, the hush of her garden at night, the weight of her hand on mine in candlelight. It all lives there, folded into the quiet exchange of a glance. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if we had crossed that line, if one of us had leaned in instead of holding back. If that week had become something more, something impossible to hide. Would it have destroyed her? Would it have destroyed me? But then I remember the way she said it. Some things can't be. But that doesn't make them less real. And I understand. What we had wasn't meant to last beyond those nights. It wasn't a story for anyone else to witness, only for us to carry. I think about the small, ordinary things that made it extraordinary: the brush of her fingers against mine, the sound of her laugh filling a quiet room, the way her eyes softened when she forgot to be the judge's wife and just let herself be a woman. And I carry it. Not as regret, but as proof that sometimes the most powerful connections aren't the ones that last forever. They're the ones that arrive quietly, change you, and then leave you standing with the memory of who you were when you felt most alive. So, when people ask me why I look at her the way I do, I only smile and say nothing. Because how could I explain? How could I put into words that she will always be the memory of a week when time stood still? A week when two people found each other in the emptiness of silence. A week when love didn't need to be spoken, or acted upon, to be real. And maybe that's enough.